welcome everybody to the second ever Ben's Book Club. I'm very excited to be your host today. As always, I want to encourage you all to please be having your questions ready, typing them in chat, letting us know where you're from. I really want this to be a really, really inclusive time and just everyone coming together and being part of a good conversation. And I don't want it to be just me. So I want all of you guys to be presences during this chat. And without further ado, let me continue let's talk to Jane Caro. Jane is a Walkley Award-winning journalist. Here she is. Let's everyone say hi to Jane. Hi, Jane. Welcome.
Thanks, Ben. Lovely to be with you all.
Lovely to have you. And you're a Walkley Award-winning journalist, social commentator, media personality, an absolute powerhouse. You do like a million zillion things all the time. I really don't think I need to introduce you too drastically to everyone. I think most people are here for you, which is fair enough, I think. So Jane, how are you? How's your very sedate, quiet existence?
That's right. Me doing absolutely nothing. I'm really well, actually, surprisingly well, given that I'm, racing around promoting this book and also trying to run for the Senate in New South Wales in the next election. I did not mean those two things to happen at the same time, may I say, but they have. And I'm still not got COVID. So I don't understand how that's happening. I'm triple vaxxed, but nevertheless, I know lots of people who are triple vaxxed and have got COVID. I'm just, so far so good, really lucky.
Yeah.
But so I'm feeling lucky actually at the moment. That's exactly how I'm feeling.
It's pretty I wanted to talk to you about this because I'm astounded. Like I watch your career from afar and again, I didn't feel like I was exaggerating to say you do a million zillion things. But how do you do all the things? And does it feel like everything is such a joy, right? Because it's fulfilling this message and this idea of yourself that you have, this legacy that you're leaving, right? But at the same time, you must get tired, surely.
I do get tired, but I'm going to cut the long story short, but I overcame an anxiety neurosis in my late 30s, early 40s. And one of the things I really learnt as I worked my way through anxiety was that most of anxiety and fear is anticipation. And a lot of us put an enormous amount of energy into anticipating things. And I decided I would just stop anticipating. I would just do the next thing and then do the next thing and then do the next thing. And you have no idea how much energy that saves you. If you don't agonize and imagine and pre-disaster and try to control everything that might possibly happen or go wrong, which is what I was doing previously, driving myself insane and I'm sure everyone else around me. But once I learned that, don't anticipate, just do the next thing. And also I dropped my expectations. So I stopped expecting myself to be brilliant or, the star of the show. I just thought,
Sure.
I'll just be me. I'll just go do what I do. I'll do it as well as I can. But how other people react to it is up to them. The energy that saves is just extraordinary. And it sort of
blown
frees
away.
you up. It frees you up. You can just go and do whatever it is people ask you to do because you're not hanging a whole lot of really intense emotions around it. It's just a thing.
I feel like I feel like I needed to write that down or something. Like that's so brilliant. Can I say
10 years
Jane,
of therapy.
You gave us the shortcut. Thank you.
I did. I got you the outcome.
Yeah. I've been anticipating talking to you and I've been sort of thinking about, I want to do a good job. I want to present you the best way possible in your book. And now I feel like, I don't know, I'm going to take this forward. Thank you, Jane. All right. End of book. No, I'm only kidding. We need to talk about this wonderful book. Can I ask you this question? Because I know you've written a lot of books, but how did this idea first present itself? Like, boom, I want to write about the theme of coercive control and domestic violence within Australia? Or did it go, boom, I want to write a piece of fiction? Or was it both at the same time? Like what made you write it in this sort of way?
Well, this is the only time it's ever happened to me that an idea has kind of come to me fully formed. And it came out of we see far too regularly all those appalling headlines. There's a horrible domestic murder or incident, and we sort of go through a kind of ritualized process almost of, this terrible things happened. There's all sorts of talk about it. There are articles, there's people analyze it, etc., etc. Everyone says it's dreadful, we must do something, and we all go back to normal. And nobody does anything really. And it happens again. And it was out of one of those where I saw a photograph. It was a particularly awful murder, suicide, included children as well as the woman. And I saw a photograph of the woman and her children with an older woman, not her mother, it might have been a grandmother, I don't know, but an older woman. The older woman's face had been pixelated out, but I looked at this older woman, and I've got 2 daughters and I've got 2 grandchildren. And I looked at this woman with this, terrible, tragic family and what had happened. And I was just thinking, like I'm sure so many people did when they saw the photograph, oh my God, how must she feel? And then I thought, how would I feel if it was me? And what would I do? And then I thought, I know what I'd want to do. And that's where the idea came from. And so it wasn't really about, it didn't come from, I want to write a book about this or any of that. It just came from a sense of, I guess, fellow feeling, identification. With an older woman who had found herself in this appalling situation. So it was a moment of when your imagination kind of takes you into something you hope you never go in any other way except in your imagination.
And I felt like presenting this in a work of fiction, like, to you, does fiction do something very different to what nonfiction can do? And I guess, what to you does fiction do that might be a little bit different?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I've written actually more nonfiction than fiction. This is my 4th novel, but it is my first. I hate saying adult novel because it sounds like it's full of porn, but it's my first novel for adults. The others were all young adult.
Novel for adults, not adult novel.
It still sounds weird. Anyway, so I've written 4 novels, but most of my books, because I've written 13 in total, are nonfiction. So I am really interested in the different ways that fiction and nonfiction kind of engage the reader. And I think that both do something really important. So I'm not making a comparison. I don't think it's a competition.
No.
But I think, and I mean, Jess Hill has written the absolute seminal book about domestic violence and coercive control, and it was a very important resource when I was, See What You Made Me Do.
I wanted to talk to you about it.
Brilliant book. And it was an incredibly important resource for this book. But when I had the idea, I knew immediately it had to be fiction, because I did not want to play fast and loose with somebody's real life.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
It needed to be out of my imagination, and completely out of my imagination, not stealing things like, writers are terrible thieves. We steal shit. I mean, I did steal minor incidents, mostly from my daughter's lives, for which they fortunately have forgiven me eventually. But nothing major, and nothing that would be terribly painful, because, this is an area where you're writing about something that does occur to real people right now. So there's a real necessity to be responsible, I think, and sensitive about that. So I wanted it to be from my imagination.
You mentioned how many readers and people have already contacted you, just saying, this is my life. And you can imagine, it would be, if you acknowledge, like, I took this from this person's life, like what damage that could do to that person, and how the people on the other end of it would read it. Like, it would be, I think that's absolutely right to fictionalize it, for sure.
Had to be fiction. But there's something else, I think. Nonfiction is, by its very nature, it's persuasive. It's to put an argument, a case, and to get you to think about that case, and to agree with the perspective, and to, put all the facts and the figures and the evidence and the reports. And And it can include lots of personal stories and lots of real examples, all of that. And I mean, I've rarely read a nonfiction book that I felt did that as effectively as See What You Made Me Do.
Yes.
But fiction, on the other hand, takes you out of your head. And it really, if it's successful, it takes you into your heart and your guts.
Absolutely agree.
And so, unfortunately, one of the things we still do when we talk about domestic violence and coercive control and all this kind of thing is we're often judgmental. And we're judgmental when we're sitting in our heads and looking at this thing over here and going, well, that could never happen to me. I would never get myself in that situation. And then we can pass judgment and kind of dismiss or blame the people who find themselves in this situation. And fiction doesn't let you do that.
No, you have to feel it.
You have to feel it. You have to go on the journey too. You know, if you're going to enjoy the book and not give up, you're going to have to get so engaged with what's going on that you feel their fear, you feel their dilemma, you toss around the dilemmas and the struggles and the difficulty and the bewilderment and the unsureness and the you know, making wrong decisions and right decisions. And so you get out of judgment and into compassion.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge. Because I felt like that, you know, I've read books where I certainly don't agree with everything the person says, everything the character does and says. I don't agree with their politics. I don't agree with everything, but I end up feeling as though I got to know a real human being. And then next time a person in my real life presents in this way that is maybe a bit abrasive or does something where they're, you know, I disagree with them, I end up being kinder, I think, in my response and a little bit more generous. And I think, I don't know about you, but I feel like life could use a lot more of those sorts of people, right? Like just being able to be, to view each other generously. I think we're missing a little bit of that sometimes.
Yeah, to actually recognize that none of us have got this life sorted, and any of us at any time can find ourselves dealing with things we never expected to have to deal with, making decisions we never thought we'd have to face.
Yeah.
And that if we don't happen to have done that yet or be doing it now, that's more often a matter of luck than good management, which is another reason I set this book specifically in quite a privileged middle class environment. First of all, that's me, you know, that's where I come from. So write what you know,
Absolutely.
But also I didn't want to, I wanted to say this can happen to anyone, you know, that you don't have to be a particular people. A lot of people seem to think, oh, this is a bunch of marginalized people who already, you know, live with deficits and they're a bit tragic, but, you know, I'm not like that. No. And I think, to be fair, Miriam, the main character, certainly would have that view at the beginning of the book and for quite a long time. It's partly it's her having to learn, you know, bullshit, Miriam, you're just as vulnerable as anybody else. And you know.
That's so good. I love how you took Miriam on that journey, and that she did start off like with this, she was privileged and she was sort of, you know,
smug about it.
Yeah. Like this would never happen to someone of my class and upbringing and etc. But and when you take her all the way back, you sort of find out like there are a few things in her past that are a bit more interesting than that. We're going to get into spoilers today too, by the way, everybody watching. So if you haven't read it already, it is the book club. So we are going to be talking about everything. But if you wouldn't mind, Jane, I want to. This is Ben being an author, just trying to be better at what I do as well. But I noticed in the back in your acknowledgement section that you and I actually share a publisher and an editor. So Jane and Ali. I wanted to talk about what their influence on this book has been, and the value of a publisher and an editor, and how they helped you shape the entire thing.
Well, I think Jane in particular gave me the confidence to keep writing it, her and my literary agents, Jacinta Demaze, because they liked it. And we underestimate how much writers need someone to like what they're doing and to do what is the literal meaning of the word encourage, which is to pass on courage. And so Jane and Jacinta both definitely did that for me, because this was very new territory for me, and it was not necessarily an area or a subject that I'd ever thought I'd write about. So I was very kind of, in the beginning. So that's something that I think we don't acknowledge and value enough. The power of somebody saying, no, this is good, keep going.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah. And
And it feels earned. It feels earned from Ali too. I don't know whether you had that experience.
Oh
But
God,
it's
yeah.
just pages of notes, and then there's one comment that said, "Bloody brilliant." And you're like, dine out on that for days.
Exactly. Ali was incredibly important to this book, because when I submitted the first draft, she came back and said, no, there's something that you've got to change. You've approached this sort of ask about. And I read what she'd said and I thought, good, she's right. And so I had to go back and restructure certainly the way the book kind of, the chronology of the book and how.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Interestingly, it wasn't as hard to do. When I first read her response, I thought, oh shit, that's going to be really difficult. Actually, when I went to do it, wasn't particularly difficult. It sort of slipped really quite easily into what she was saying. So that was really important. And specifically, it had to do with Miriam's attitude to Nick. That was a really big thing. At first,
Really?
in the first draft, she didn't like him.
Really?
In the second draft, she likes him. It's much more powerful.
Okay.
Much more powerful. So that was really an important insight from someone reading it from the outside.
I wanted to mention it because it's like he pulls the wool over her eyes as well, and then she falls for it as well, and so that is so interesting. Hey, like, yeah.
And that was so important. And I, like you, there was a point where Ali said to me, I think the note was, that she really liked it and she liked the humor in it, which was good because it's a dark book, but there is the occasional joke or aside.
Mm-hmm.
But she said that she had learned something important to her. I won't go into the details, that came out of a conversation between Miriam and Fiona. And that was so wonderful to think that something I'd written in a conversation between two fictional characters had an enlightening effect on someone as well-read and insightful as Ali. So, that was my this is brilliant moment as far as Ali's concerned. And you're right, she's never annihilating with her criticism at all. It's always very positive criticism, but she's hard to impress.
Yes.
And they're always the most important people to impress.
Yes, exactly. I always found I get a good note from her when I put in some really potty humor. She really likes asses.
She likes a bit of, yes. And she liked my swearing. Some readers don't.
Yeah. I actually had a question here from Deb. Deb wanted me to show the book, so I'm just going to hold it up here. It is a wonderful cover. So there's the book, Deb, and thank you for all your questions. I'm just hogging Jane for a little bit. It's my bad. But I wanted to talk again. This is something else I heard you discuss briefly, I think on your interview on the Garrett. But you mentioned how terrible, and I can see there are some men in the chat today, so big ups to you guys, but men on average, we're pretty terrible with our reading habits in that we don't read as much as women do. And then that when we do read, we tend to stick to masculine authors. And, I grew up reading books, and it was never certain. You don't go to your schoolmates and go, hey, I read this wonderful novel the other night. It really opened my eyes to this really important social, as a man, it wasn't something that was, really encouraged in the culture, I guess. So I guess my question is, where do you think that comes from, this reluctance of men to engage in reading?
Such a big question. I think a lot of it is to do that it actually good fiction in particular, because I think men are often more comfortable with non-fiction when they do read.
Like autobiographies of sport figures.
Yeah, that kind of thing, or information books. And that's fine. I like good nonfiction as much as the next person, and I love a memoir. But I think it has to do with the fact that fiction does engage the emotions. And one of the things that unfortunately we do, or we certainly did, I hope we're getting better at it now, but we actually separate little boys from their emotions. We're very, don't cry, don't be a big girl, I'll give you something to cry about. Don't be so weak. Don't be a sissy. It's all about never ever being in touch with your softer emotions.
For sure.
We separate. We actually groom little boys not to feel comfortable accessing those softer, more gentle emotions. Vulnerability. They're not really allowed to show vulnerability from a very early age, and novels rely on you being okay with getting in touch with your own vulnerabilities and your own fears and your own
they do for sure.
sense of of how insignificant and hopeless we all are. And so I think that's part of the reason. But even one of the things, and this is a particular gripe I have as a female writer, is that even men who do read fiction tend to read, as you said, male authors. Women will read men and women. Men often only read men. And the same with films, and particularly children's films. Gina Davis has got a whole institute about this, and Finding Nemo is one of the best examples you can think of, because there's only one female fish in the entire ocean and she can't remember her name from 1 minute to the next. It's wonderful, really. The little girls must just love it. Get such a role model about what their life's going to be like.
I never thought that about Finding Nemo.
We don't even notice. It's so common that girls are brought up to identify with a male protagonist. Boys are brought up to reject the idea of a female protagonist. If it's got a female protagonist, it's for girls. It's not for boys.
Yeah.
What that does is it cuts the opportunities for female creatives in half. Because if we've only got half the audience, half the people are going to buy the books. Okay, we've got one advantage: more of us read books, so that's good. But it actually limits the opportunities that we have, because we train boys. We're so frightened of men and boys being feminized. I mean, maybe that's what that whole bizarre transphobia bullshit that's going on at the moment is all about. Fundamentally, I don't know. I don't understand it at all. But we're very afraid of the feminization of boys and men. And I mean, why Harry Potter had to be called Harry Potter, but actually it should have been called Hermione Granger. But J.K. Rowling knew that if she called it Hermione Granger, only half the audience would read it.
Yeah, that's interesting. My kids are in love with these books called Wolf Girl, and I have 2 boys, and so I think we're on a good. Yeah, I think we're on a good path. But I guess we'll check.
My grandson loves Owlette. He wants to be Owlette whenever he's to be a superhero.
Oh, heck yeah. Owlette is the coolest of the 3. What are they? I've forgotten. My kids are older now.
Yeah. What are they called?
Guys in the chat, help us out. Not the Thundercats. I don't know why that's in my head. Catboy. Oh, anyway.
Owlette, and there's one other. And
Gecko.
The kids love it. Gecko. That's it.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, they're great. He loves Owlette.
You know what I really enjoyed was watching them non-stop for 7 years. That was
PJ Masks.
That was it. Did someone write it?
Somebody cut. Yeah, Janine Kimberly. She cracked
it. Thank you, Janine. PJ Masks. Yeah. So other people are also super invested in PJ Masks. All right. Let's move into talking a little bit about I want to talk about the moral problem in this novel, and I want to talk about the ending as well. We've already had a couple people ask this question. I'll see if I can scroll back just to find their names. But a few people have actually asked. So if you don't mind, I'll just talk quickly about the story. But Miriam is a grandma, but she's the mother to 2 daughters, and one is named Ali, and Ali falls in love with this man named Nick, and everything seems to be going well to a point. There's a few iffy things, but there's this really slow, and something I really loved about the book too was just what a slow, subtle shifting it is. Whereas it's like you don't just instantly know who the mustache twirling, because it's like it's real people. Yeah. So I really like that about the book. But eventually Nick really turns and starts to get quite violent, aggressive, to the point of nearly running Miriam over with his car. And then Miriam has to make a choice, and her choice is she's gone to the police. And again, I really enjoyed how you didn't demonize people in this book. Like, everyone's actually trying to help, but the system is not allowing them to do much. So she goes to the police, she just exhausts all her options, and she's like, Nick will not leave my daughter and my grandkids alone. And so Miriam decides to actually go and buy a weapon, although she'd bought it before. She didn't know she was going to use it for this purpose.
Mm.
And she shoots Nick. And it's drastic and violent. And she just says, yep, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to pay the price of going to prison. And she gets jail time and she sacrifices that, but she does it in a way where she's rescuing her daughter and her grandkids from this awful person who won't stop. The few people in the chat who have asked this question, and I love how you've also already talked and brought it up about being sensitive to this, but like, are you afraid that someone's going to read this? Because someone mentioned, sorry, I forget who it was, but they said that this person here, sorry, Vanessa, there's never actually been, or she hasn't heard of any cases where mothers have actually turned violent. So mothers just, and I can see you sort of, you're agreeing with that? Not that we've heard of.
No, there's certainly cases where women have murdered their abusers. That has happened quite a lot, but it's unusual.
But not mothers.
Not the mother of the abused woman. Yeah,
and obviously, and you talked about it too, like that would be what you'd want to do, right? Because of your instinct in protectiveness. But were you concerned with like someone reading this and then being like a copycat? I mean, I know that's not your concern really, but I guess that's the question really.
Yeah. I mean, that would be hideous. If such a thing happened, I would be devastated.
Yeah.
But you know, our fiction, our films, our TV series are saturated with blood and violence and murder and all kinds of things. So there's obviously something in the human condition, which means we need to work through these things in a safe way. So stories and fiction, I mean, if you look at fairy tales, particularly before they got Disneyized in their original, they're grim, like Grimm's fairy tales. Okay, that was a coincidence. That happened to be the guy's last name. But nevertheless, you know, a lot of them are quite grim. So there's something in humanity where we need to, I heard it described once as safe danger, where we need to look at these dangerous things.
And to avoid them, right?
Well, partly to avoid them, but also to rehearse them, because somebody once described tickling to me as actually mimicking being eaten by a wild animal, and which is quite interesting when you think about it, because they were basically saying, and they were arguing that, you know how everybody slows down when there's a traffic accident to have a look?
Yes.
And we all go, oh, ghouls, they shouldn't do that. Yet we all do it. They were saying, yes, because, you know, we all have to be aware at some level that terrible things can happen. And so in a way, we need to be exposed to them in a safe way, so that if a terrible thing does actually, we've actually had some pre-exposure to it, so that we've got some resources to deal with it. And that made some sense to me. But I agree, so I don't think you can't make fiction a place where you can't explore these dark questions. That would be that would almost defeat the purpose.
Yeah, it should be a safe place to do so, right?
It's a safe, because it's imaginary. We're making up a story here. It hasn't happened, as you say, and these people don't exist. So we can play with them, if you like, as sort of avatars, as puppets.
Yeah. Like what would happen and play it out properly.
And play it out. And look, Miriam, it's not good. Miriam doesn't get away with it.
No, yeah, she does cop it. Yeah.
She goes to jail.
She does. I used to make my mum's my biggest supporter. She's actually in the chat right now. She's everywhere I go. She used to come to I used to be in a band, and she used to come and watch me and do this.
Mothers are wonderful.
She's the best. But I used to try to trick her with that, because I used to want to play violent video games when I was a kid. I used to be like, well, if something violent happens in front of me, I've learned how to deal with this violence. Like I'm numb to it now. She never fell for that. So good on your mum.
You don't want to be numb to it.
No, but that's a good point too. Yeah.
You actually want to be the opposite of numb to it. You actually want to feel it, and therefore think to yourself, we have to do something to stop this ever happening. It's the same as watching films or reading books about the Holocaust. You know, that's not to get numb to it. That's actually to become
to like heighten yourself. Yeah. I should have changed my argument to my mum. Clearly,
should have.
I was only 12.
You needed to talk to another mother.
yeah. Thanks, Jane. I think Anne here has really put this well. So Anne Randalls has posted this question or the statement, but I think this really goes into play with the book and to do with the psychology of the characters. But it says here, it can be scary to admit that it's that this is what's happening in your relationship, right? And so we want, and I think Ali does this, and I think Miriam does this too, where they want to look at Nick in a very positive way, and they see this thing where he's a bit dicey, like he's calling her Sonny all the time. And we're, oh no, well, I've had a nickname too. Like it just means he loves her. And we're always trying our best to not face, I guess, the reality. A few people have mentioned too that they'd figured out that he was like this well before Miriam did too. Can you speak of that a little bit? Just, this idea of like how difficult it is to look at yourself with that lens, I guess.
We believe what we want to believe, and we try as hard as we can not to see the thing that's right in front of us if it's unbearable. And Miriam desperately, remember Miriam's loses her husband, her beloved husband, 3 chapters in. So she's raw as well. She's dealing with her own terrible, overwhelming grief. And she hasn't got, to use a horrible term, but I can't think of a better one, the bandwidth to kind of take on. And she was never particularly good at that. Like, she wanted to get on with her own life, didn't want to necessarily be dealing with all the messy psychological stuff that's going on with the kids. And if mothers are honest, we all feel like that. Somebody said to me once, you're only as unhappy as your unhappiest child, in which case, don't find out if they're unhappy. I don't mean you shouldn't, but what I'm saying is mothers are human too, and we don't want to be unhappy, so we will engage in psychological protection too, and that will often mean that we don't want to look at the fact that our children's marriage may be problematic. It may not be terrible like Ali and Nick's was, and partly there's a good side to that too. We don't want to interfere. The trope of the interfering mother-in-law is so overpowering that just about every mother-in-law spends her entire life trying never to go near that thing. And that can mean you miss stuff. And there's always that game you play where you think, should I say anything? Oh, probably I should. You adult children, how much do you give your opinion? Is it really wanted?
And that's not asked for, right?
Yeah. And I think those dilemmas are good and healthy and part of everyone's life, but that doesn't always mean they work out well.
No, for sure.
We have this idea that if we do the right thing and behave in the right way, the outcome will be good. That's not always true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Miriam's actually a very good, loving mother, but she makes lots of mistakes. Well, hello.
I think she starts off. Yeah, she starts off talking. She starts off talking pretty down on herself too. Like she's quite cruel to herself.
Mothers are we're consumed with guilt, and because we are basically told that the way our children turn out is entirely our responsibility. It's not the same for fathers. They're not handed the same level of responsibility for the happiness and psychological well-being of their children that mothers still
don't get the level of blame, right?
Exactly. In fact, it used to infuriate me when my children were small, and my husband, my kids were small in the 80s and 90s, and my husband was pretty good and hands-on and everything for that period of time. But oh my God, people made such a fuss about him. Oh, he's a hero, Oh, he changes nappies without complaining. He likes to give them a bath in the evening. The man's a miracle. Are you kidding? He was doing the bare minimum. Whereas I was doing, 90% of everything else. I never got praise for all the things I did. What I got was criticized for the things I didn't do.
Yeah.
And that's the mother paradigm. That's what we work in, and we do it to ourselves. Every time we give our kids a pizza for dinner at night, instead of hand making a bloody marvelous, pure, perfectly nutritionally balanced meal that we then all sit down and joyfully eat. In what universe does that ever happen? we blame ourselves. We tear the pizza boxes up into tiny little bits so the neighbours won't know we did it.
Oh, that's awful. I've see, I'm the cook in our family, but I don't feel that sense. Like when I give my kids just a Kit Kat for their snack at lunchtime, I'm like, that's fine, they can have a Kit Kat. And I don't feel the sense of shame when I give them the Kit. Oh, that's fine. You
Yeah,
know what I mean? So
exactly.
it's different.
But yeah, we consume ourselves with this constant questioning of what did we do wrong?
Yeah, like a
What,
self-criticism sort of thing.
yeah, all the time. And I wanted to reveal that. But at the same time, I wanted Miriam to be, there's a part of Miriam that rejects that as well.
Yes.
She's,
Yep.
she doesn't buy into it completely. She often says things like, why doesn't anyone ever blame Pete?
Yes.
She does have
It
that
does, yeah.
sense of it's not fair.
Injustice,
Um,
yeah.
hmm,
I want to go back a little bit to another question from the chat. This is more of a comment, but it has a question at the end of it. But it's talking about this idea of change
hmm.
in the system, which I think is mainly, if you had to point out an antagonist in your book, it would be Nick first and foremost, but also the system that won't allow Nick to be stopped. And so Vanessa said, I agree. I'm not sure what she was agreeing to. This is a little bit back, but I wouldn't have just picked up a book to read on domestic violence. Your novel, even though it was fiction, made me want to help change something in our system. But it
Good.
seems such an ingrained undercurrent to everything. How do you see it as something that can change in the future? Where do we need to start?
Well, I think one of the things we need to start doing is already happening, which I think is really exciting. There's been a plethora of books just in the last little while about this kind of subject. Deborah Oswald's written one. I think The Torrent's about it. There's another one. I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, that's true. The torrent, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like there's a sort of tipping point and we've reached it. And so now we're starting to deal with these subjects about, and I mean, they have been dealt with before. The wonderful and underrated Anne Bronte wrote one of the first books about this stuff called The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. If you haven't read it, go back and read it.
No, I haven't read
Fantastic.
it.
It's brilliant. And it's about an abused woman.
Wow.
And yeah, it's way before its time, but it's not been a subject we've dealt with head on very often. So I think we're starting to do that. I think women are they're refusing to take the shame in the way that they used to. We've just been talking about motherhood and shame. I think that still exists, and we need to be very vigilant about getting rid of a lot of that too.
Hmm.
But I think we're now starting to refuse to take the shame for male bad behavior. And I think this has to do with Me Too, when women basically suddenly realized, oh, I didn't do anything that caused me to be assaulted, humiliated.
The victim blaming stuff, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just a woman, and somebody decided to take advantage of their powerful position over me, and I am not the one who owns the shame here. He is, and that was a revolutionary movement. I still don't think we've fully realized how powerful that's been. I wonder, in fact, if Scott Morrison's going to come up against it at the next election, because I think
Mm.
they're totally ignoring the fury of women out there, yet I'm seeing it wherever I go.
Yeah, sure.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But that's huge. And that doesn't just happen in the area of let's put a wall around sexual assault and safety in the workplace. That's rippling outwards to everything, including domestic violence and particularly coercive control. And we're doing something really, really powerful with coercive control now. We're describing it
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that women who find themselves in a relationship which starts to show the very clear and somewhat predictable flags that they are in a coercively controlling relationship will have an idea that that's what's going on. Because when we didn't describe it,
Yeah, it was just you put it under the rug, right?
bewildered and didn't know why they were being treated this way.
Yeah.
And they deny it. And so they think, oh, I must have exaggerated or, built it up into more than it was. But now we're starting to describe it: fiction, non-fiction, articles, reports, whatever it is. And we're starting to talk about criminalizing it. But there are a couple of other things we need to look at. One is that grooming of little boys and little girls. I mean, just a tiny example, go into any children's clothing store, and I'm doing that a lot more now as a fond grandma. And I've got a grandson and a granddaughter, and I look at the clothes for both of them. First of all, they're gender divided brutally for reasons I don't quite understand. But when I look at if they've got little animals or whatever on the T-shirts for little girls, they're butterflies or kittens or rabbits or unicorns. If you look at the ones on the T-shirts for little boy, they're wolves and gorillas and lions and tigers and sharks.
Aggressive animals.
Predators and prey, ladies and gentlemen.
Yep.
Predators and prey. Stop it. Stop it. We shouldn't be doing that. And the romantic myth, the idea that there is some man out there who will sweep you off your feet. Terribly, terribly vulnerable position to have your feet off the ground. Scary.
Yeah.
You are controlled. If you have been swept off your feet, I am sorry, somebody else is controlling you. We have romanticized abuse. We have turned it into something to be aspired to. We've got to change that.
Yeah, and I think like conversations, even like what we're having now, right? These are the small things that help push those things. I'm just seeing a lot of love for you in the comments. I just want to mention a couple of them. Chris said, Jane, I love you and your motherly comments, which is really nice. Alex actually said that, I'm not sure, Alex, gender-wise, but others judge women and mothers, and I think that's really true. Stacey has said women have been conditioned to be self-critical. Joe has said women are also critical of other women.
Yes, and that does happen.
Yeah.
And it's because we internalize the criticism. I mean, misogyny and sexism are not just something that men do to women. They are something that women do to women, and most tragically of all, women do it to themselves. Elizabeth Broderick said it brilliantly. She said, misogyny and sexism are like asbestos in the walls. We breathe them in. We're all brought up in a sexist and misogynistic society. And so women are no more immune to that than men are. So women, we're really hard. Sometimes we're really hard on one another. I try actually really hard not to try to see the point of view of the woman that everyone is saying is the bitch. I sometimes fail. I'm failing a bit at the moment with someone I can think of. But I do
So do we all.
I try to recognize that they are working within an oppressive system which automatically looks at them like there's no right way to be a woman. You're always too something. You're too quiet. You're too loud. You're too fat. You're too thin. You're too pushy. You're too submissive. You're too ambitious. You're too compliant. You know, we are always too something. So that was another revelation I had at some point when I was overcoming the anxiety neurosis, where I realized that there was no right way to be a woman. So I would just be a woman in my own completely wrong way. And that would be fine. And that has worked out okay.
That's, that's great. And if only more of us could do that, right? I want to mention Alex. Thank you. Yes, I see that Alex is she. There's a lot of people actually reiterating some of the books you've mentioned here too, which is awesome to see. Book club going on, right? I wanted to talk quickly about a couple of the things you laid into your novel that are those red flags. And two that really struck me that I hadn't thought of before was Nick giving a nickname to Ali, giving her the nickname that's different from the one she had, which is Sunny, which is quite possessive and, you know, she's mine now. This is my Sunny, right? And then you also, and this is one I thought was really interesting, well, both of them, but the security system that he installs. Because when he put it in, and I'm reading this book, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, maybe. I was doing the Miriam thing. Maybe he did win it from work. And then it came out later, like, this is one of the red flags, right? So, yeah, can you talk about the layering in of those things and how they work out as far as in situations of coercive control?
I was very, very lucky when I first started on this project. I knew I had to do my research properly. So I went and spoke to a number of people, but one of the most important people I spoke to was Annabelle Daniel, who is the CEO of Women's Community Shelters and has worked in this sector, you know, for a really long time. And I wanted to get from her whether I should write this book at all or not. And, you know, any help she could give me, any advice, any information that I needed. And so I went and spoke to her, and two things happened. The first was she said, yes, we definitely need a novel in this area. This is great. You'll reach a whole new readership. So that was really good. But then she also sent me, when I got home, she'd sent me something, and she said, look, I've got this judgment. And it was from a very famous, horrible case where a man threw his partner off the balcony of a multi-story building in the middle of Sydney. It's quite a few years ago now. He's still in jail, I think, for the murder of his partner. But Annabelle said to me, the judge's summing up, this was coercive control that ended up in homicide. The judge's summing up of the case, which is what she sent me, she said, is absolutely the best and most thorough kind of explanation of how coercive control unravels and what it does and what's the sort of really telltale signs of it that I've ever read. So I basically used that judgment as the sort of source material for most of the things in the build-up. Once it got to the more kind of absolutely desperate part of the book, all of that was from my imagination. But the build-up, I had this fabulous blueprint that basically said, and one of the biggest things about it was this obsession with monitoring. So we also know that, yes, they put in elaborate security systems. Certainly this poor young woman who ended up being killed was monitored constantly, but they also will bug your phone, bug your car. So they always know where you are. They will always know what the most recent text message you got was. And that can make you feel crazy because they'll say, oh, you told me. And you think, I didn't tell them. But how else would they know? Because people who don't behave like that don't think about that being, and in a way, perpetrators and con artists and all sorts of people, Donald Trump, all sorts of people who fool everyone else are aware that most people don't think about these things. So they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt every time because that's how they would behave and that's how they see the world. And so if you don't behave like that, you'll get away with it for a really long time.
It's a bit crazy too, isn't it, that they're so predictable? You know, like there's no book that they're going to buy that says, 10 top ways to coercively control your partner, but it seems they seem to follow this blueprint and just almost to the letter sometimes, right? It's really strange.
And yet I think there's another way of looking at the book, and I didn't write it with this in mind, but I often don't find out what I was really writing about until sometime after I finished the book. I don't know if that's your experience, but it's certainly mine. But
yes, it is absolutely.
That in a way, Miriam is an avatar for us. She represents us. So we're not the people being abused and controlled. We're the people watching others being abused and controlled. So all the excuses, all the rationalizations, all the not wanting to see, that's us. That's what we do. That's what we've done for centuries. We've turned our face away. We've explained it. In a way, you could make an argument, I probably would make an argument, that women have been suffering from some form of coercive control by the whole of the society. People of colour have too, people with a disability. They have had their lives curtailed and controlled for centuries. I often feel that women for a very long time, and it's only just changing now, have lived in the spaces around the men in their lives. They've squeezed themselves in around.
Yeah.
And they're only just starting to say, you know what, I want a bit more room. And that's where all the agony and the friction and the fury from a lot of people is coming because they're being asked to make a bit more room. And sometimes that can feel like you're losing something. My view is you gain a whole lot more in the end, but you can feel a bit uncomfortable while you're shuffling over to make room.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of comments that we've had that are just saying like this book really was confronting, like it did make people feel quite uncomfortable, which I think is really the point, right? I had a comment here from Sylvia, which I wanted to read out to you because I think this is going into what we've been talking about here. It says, Sylvia says this, we are all brought up in a patriarchal culture. With globalization, really everything is even more entrenched. This culture is also controlling men as well. They're stuck too, because if they deviate, they're often the target of abuse from other men. And, that's as a kid who grew up in the country liking Nintendo and books, like, it's absolutely right. Like, and if you feel overly sensitive, you're seen as a wimp, you're seen as a coward, not really a man. And I guess this is what we're talking about, right? Like books like this are things that can help change. This is stuff that people feel in the guts, like you say, right? And is that, I guess, kind of a mission statement of this book? Is that sort of what you were thinking when it
Well,
came out?
I hope so. I mean, I want people to get engaged and involved in the story. But yes, I want them then to think about and have conversations about why are our relationships like this and why can they so easily veer into this kind of toxic extreme.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about almost one woman a week being murdered by her intimate partner, this is not as rare as people think. And not that all of them get to that really extreme, but interesting. Like even Miriam has to look back and is challenged by her neighbour Julie.
Yeah, I thought
That her
that.
husband had a bit of controlling. Now it was protective, and this is another thing I think, that protection and control, where does one stop and the other begin? And you need to be really careful about that. So yeah, I want people to think about all those things. Of course I do. And I think with any great, I'm not saying my book's great, but any great work of fiction, any great book, that is what they do. They get you to think about stuff in a different way, and to, when we say something moves us, we literally mean it moved us from one emotional state to another emotional state.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And so when that happens, I think there's a shift also in the way we see the world, whether that lasts for any length of time or not. But that time there was a shift in the way we see the world. And I think that's fiction's job. I think fiction is meant to shift the way we see the world. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously, I want us to think broader about the relationships between men and women, about what love means, between parents and children. I mean, Sally, Nick's mother, it was one of the characters I really was interested in, because, the imaginative journey to think of being the mother of the victim is one thing, but what must it be like to be the mother of the perpetrator?
Yeah.
What that must be. I mean,
Yeah, and I think you do a good job of painting her, I think, quite sympathetically, even though she's not really, but I mean, you can you sort of see again, she's willfully turning that eye, right? She's willful, and she's also a person, I think it's subtly done, but you get the sense that she's been also controlled and dominated her entire life as well. And so,
and if you have your entire life, and I often think this about, very conservative women, sometimes very older women who are very down on this stuff and get quite angry if their daughters try to move out or broaden the way. And I think, well, I can understand that, because if you've lived your whole life like that, the last thing you want to do is turn around and say, shit, I could have had a much better life. I never thought I could. I was always told the parameters within which I had to live were this narrow.
Yeah.
And that was all I had. And I can't bear to think that was a lie. And maybe I could have. But the thing is,
devastating, right?
Yeah, but of course, probably you couldn't, because we're all dealing with the times, the situations, the circumstances in which we land when we're born. And for a very long time, women had very narrow little areas that they could kind of move in. And there were a few amazing women who got out of that, but they were exceptions. These days, I think we're very lucky in that those boundaries have been pushed wider. And that's where things are really starting to change in exciting ways. But I have great sympathy for women like Sally, for those who haven't had that opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate how candid you've been this evening. And there's been, like, I'm reading through the chat. There's so many people having really great conversations about this, which is, I think, one of the best things about, like you say, about fiction, that we get to start to think about these things. We get to talk about them with each other, with our friends. Um, I wanted to end with a question about Miriam, because I think that this book is a different book if there weren't those chapters of Miriam in prison at the end.
Mm.
And you've laid it throughout the whole book, but this journey that she goes on, reflecting on why she's thought the way that she's thought her entire life,
Mm.
and unpacking that, like it's like she almost needs prison to sort of unpack that. Can you talk a little bit about just that and why it's in there and why it's such an important and vital part of the book?
Well, the first thing was that I knew Miriam needed to pay for what she'd done. I mean, the judge's summing up is my probably closest to my belief about this dilemma. But at the same time, I also agree with Miriam when she says, I've done the wrong thing. I've done a terrible wrong thing, but I've done it for the right reasons. And I think that's where the moral complexity comes in and why it's interesting and why we have to mull it over so much. But
Yeah.
she had to pay for it and she wanted to pay for it. Miriam wanted to be punished for what she'd done. Not because she's masochistic, but because she felt she deserved it. And so, in a way, going to jail is the final sacrifice, because really what this is about is a woman who sacrifices herself for her daughter and her grandchildren, who basically gives up her own freedom so that they can have theirs, because they've lost their freedom, because that's Nick's whole aim, to make sure that he is in control of them. They don't have any agency. And so what she does is she removes his agency from him completely so they can get theirs back. But in the process, she loses hers. And she's aware of that. I think she feels in a weird way that that's fair, that if she takes his agency away, she should lose hers. That's a kind of bargain where both of them are paying the price.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a transaction. And part of that is her guilt about, I brought up a girl who was attracted to this man and I didn't believe it for so long, and I feel I've betrayed her. Therefore, I deserve punishment for a whole lot of things. But it's also the stripping back of all the stuff she's built up to pretend that she's someone that she's not, this middle class, successful, coiffed, very well presented woman, is really from the wrong side of the tracks, from herself an abusive family, a kind of cold abusive rather than hot abusive. And she has to come to terms with all that. She has to come to terms with who she really is. We all do, if we're going to have any kind of, forward motion in our life, really, any kind of growing up. And really, this is also the tale of Miriam growing up. And in jail, she finds a kind of redemption and she finds herself, because she's been living with all the bling.
The distractions, right?
And so she finds, and that's why at the end I wanted her still to be young enough, she's 70, early 70s, when she gets out, to still to be life ahead, and the grandchildren are still there, and there's still she can enjoy finally having stepped into not just her own power, but in fact her own vulnerability, her own weakness, her own
it's quite beautiful, really.
Self. I mean, that's what I was trying to,
like a richer, rather than like this striving thing. She's just like at peace with herself a bit, and so she can she can enjoy things more. That's really it's a nice note to end on, I think. Jane, again, thank you so much. There's a lot of support for you in the chat here. I wanted to really quickly just say, everyone who's been commenting, I really appreciate your vulnerability too. Like, there's a lot of people saying, like, this is stuff that I've been through, and it really means a lot that that you were so engaged with what we've discussed. And obviously your discussions going forward will hopefully do a lot in the way of bringing a lot of this into the forefront of our conversations in our workplaces and in our families and things like that. So yeah, thank you, Jane. I really appreciate you being here.
It's my pleasure. And anyone who's in New South Wales, if you feel like voting for me in the Senate, that'd be awesome. because then I could bring these conversations into our parliament.
There's a
You know what? They never have them.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people saying I'll be voting for you. So there's a lot of support here for you with that. I wanted to say quickly that next month we'll be looking at a book called Larimer, which is a non-fiction, and that deals with this really interesting story. There's this little town called Larimer with 13 people, but then, well, there was 14, but then one of them mysteriously disappears. And it's going to be a really, really good chat next month as well. So that'll be available on the Libby app, I think, throughout the next month. But keep on recommending this book, The Mother. Get your friends to read it. Form your own little book clubs and have discussions about what's at the center and what would you do and what needs to happen, because it's a very vital book, and I'm really glad that I got to read it and spend time with you tonight, Jane. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Ben. It was a fabulous interview. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, everyone else, good night. Thank you for being here with us, and we'll see you next month. Thanks again, Jane.
Bye.
Bye.